Thank you so much. Thank you, Gene, for your kind invitation. Peter, it's a pleasure. Um, El Salvador is indeed considerably less dangerous than it was many years ago. We cannot deny that. We cannot deny the drastic reduction in homicides, and gang presence now seems like a tale from the past in many communities. Now, by the sound of this, you may be thinking this will be a really short debate, but there's much more to say, and reality is far more nuanced. And actually, I wish I lived in that country you were describing. Um, I'm here to argue that El Salvador's security model in El Salvador is not a desirable or even transferable model for any other Latin American country. And to do that, I will use 4 points. Okay? I'm going to explain how Salvadoran institutions work. I'm going to explain how the security policy that we're going to talk about has been devised, how it was implemented, and where it's leading the country. Before I say that, I completely agree with you. Like the absence of fear is much more important than the mere absence of conflict in for a society to be considered peaceful or safe. A recent poll by one of the leading universities in El Salvador, one that Nayib Bukele has repeatedly quoted when it shows his popularity ratings, showed something that may seem strange to you. Over 60% of the people are afraid of voicing their opinions in El Salvador. And over 80% of the people believe that there may be consequences for expressing criticism of the government. In sum, Salvadorans apparently still live in some kind of fear and have done so for a long time. From fear of the military in the 70s and 80s, they moved on to fear of gangs. And now they have moved on to fear of the government. What I will try to argue today is that El Salvador may be less dangerous, but it is not safer. Unless we understand safety as the silent act to comply without questioning. And in a room with liberty minded individuals, I don't think we are. Now, point number one Salvadoran institutions. Nayib Bukele rose to power in 2019 with an anti elite and anti corruption discourse. And a country fed up with both believed in him. Shortly after, he demonstrated that he's less interested in the courtesies of democracy and the rule of law and more open to a perceived sense of effectiveness. And so some results have been visible. He promised and he seemed to deliver without minding those boring processes of institutions and the rule of law. And it's effectively leading the country into believing that there must be faster ways to achieve what we wanted to achieve. But in February 2020, something happened. In the middle of a showdown between the government and Congress, that was at the time led by the opposition, Nayib Bukele stormed our National Assembly, or Congress, with heavily armed police officers and soldiers. Now, I believe to some of you, the eloquence of good words and nice debates is a good tool, where to Bukele, I think his eloquence lies somewhere else. He sat down on the speaker's chair and said, and I quote, "It is clear who is in control now." A year later, when he gained a legislative majority, he instructed his people in Congress to get rid of the Constitutional Court and the Attorney General who was also investigating allegations of corruption in his government. The Supreme Court justices and the Attorney General were replaced by people loyal to Bukele's own party. And 2 months later, he got rid of a third of the country's judges who were replaced by, well, people loyal to Bukele's party. And so on. The Human Rights Office, the Electoral Board, the institution in charge of auditing his administration, they're all controlled by people loyal to him. This is the first point I want to make. El Salvador does not have any more checks and balances. If any other Latin American country wanted to follow his security model, step number one would be to get rid of restraints and give one person all power, and hope that that one person is good. Point number two, how the security plan was devised. Now, you may have heard of Bukele's war on gangs and his tough on crime approach, and how El Salvador's authorities have arrested almost 80,000 people, ridding the streets of criminal gangs. But this open war was not always Bukele's security model. His first approach was radically different: to broker deals with gang leaders so they would stop murdering people in exchange for benefits inside prisons, releasing prominent gang leaders, and facilitating gangs to operate some businesses. Now, this is not new in El Salvador. It has been done before. Many of Bukele's predecessors did it. Some of them are imprisoned for that. But the president who promised change ended up following the footsteps of those before him. And don't take my word for it, or that of any independent media outlets that have reported on this. Less than 3 miles away from here, I believe that is south, at the Eastern District Court, a man is being charged with transnational terrorism. His name is Elmer Canales Rivera, his alias is Crook. He's a prominent MS-13 gang leader who was arrested in Mexico in November 2023. In 2020, however, he was sentenced to a 40-year prison sentence in El Salvador. But in 2021, he walked out. And after a brief stay in a luxury apartment complex in San Salvador, he was taken to the Guatemalan border where he received a firearm, was introduced to a smuggler, and completed his escape. The person who drove him to the border was not a gang member. It was Carlos Marroquin, the head of Bukele's social threat unit, a member of his security circle. How do we know this? How do we know this for a fact? Because Carlos Marroquin himself told a gang leader in an audio that was leaked to the press that he did it to show the gang, to show MS-13 in particular, the government's loyalty and to gain their trust. I can happily share with you the link so you can hear his words. El Salvador's current security model, state of emergency, or what we call El Régimen, was imposed on March 27, 2022, after gangs took the lives of 87 people in 3 days. The reason behind this massacre is that the government failed to comply with the terms of their pact. This was also explained by Marroquin in that call that we had access to, or like another media outlet had access to. El Régimen, our security model, included the suspension of 4 fundamental rights: the privacy of communications, freedom of association, which has been reinstated, the right of legal defense upon being arrested, and an extension of the period between an arrest and someone's arraignment. It has been fortified with dozens of criminal justice reforms, such as toughening crime sentences related to gangs, extending the period in which you may be arrested without a trial, and empowering police officers. Police officers and soldiers have been given a green flag to conduct large-scale raids, they have received arrest quotas, and the government even approved prison sentences for journalists who reported on gangs and fear that this may cause despair. This has been eliminated, but the threat was constant for almost a year. From a policy perspective, this was an improvised measure once the first approach, negotiating with gangs, failed. A tough-on-crime approach that has not addressed the root causes of violence and has resorted to policing. A policy that depends on government-provided facts and figures, as independent organizations and media outlets do not receive any formal official information under the Freedom of Information Act. A policy that depends on one man and his whims. So, Gene, when you asked me about debating, or you asked me to debate about the security model, I for a second, I thought, which one? The one where he negotiates with gangs? Or the one in which he's tough on them? I assume it's the latter. Now, the third point. I've made the first two. The third point, what El Régimen has meant, what the security program has meant. Salvadorans, as I said, no longer see gang leaders roaming their communities. That is a great thing. That is not small. But that doesn't mean they live entirely safe and free. Let me tell you a story. That of Atilio Montalvo, a 72-year-old man who was part of the guerrillas during our civil war from 1980 to 1992. After the 92 peace accords, he dedicated his life to teaching economics and advocating for the rule of law. On the 30th of April, 2024, he was arrested under terrorism charges. May I remind you, 72 years old. Nayib Bukele accused him and a few other war veterans who had denounced El Salvador's democratic backsliding of plotting a terrorist attack without showing any evidence. Due to El Régimen, Mr. Montalvo was not given immediate access to an attorney. His family has denounced this as a politically motivated arrest, and they have not been given information about his whereabouts or the state of his health, given that he's diabetic and has chronic hypertension. After weeks of demanding the liberation of his dad, his son, Atilio Jr., had to leave the country as he was being harassed, followed by unmarked cars, and threatened. He's now in Mexico. Almost a year later, his dad has still not faced trial but remains in prison. A 72-year-old ill man who was accused of terrorism. Now, during the state of exception, along with this man, Atilio Montalvo, there have been over 80,000 arrests. Bukele himself recently acknowledged that around 8,000 people have been released as they found no signs of gang affiliation. But independent reporting shows that over 30,000 people may have been arrested arbitrarily in El Salvador. A media outlet published police files that were leaked recently, showing that in some cases, the reason behind the arrest is that someone seemed nervous. I don't know how often you get nervous. I'm often very nervous. I wouldn't like to be in prison for that. Some have been rounded up after anonymous calls. We also heard a credible report of a taxi driver that was falsely accused by a competitor, and he was arrested and accused of illicit association. El Régimen, as we call the security program, has meant that young people in stigmatized working-class communities are increasingly prone to be arrested and accused of being associated with gangs. Police brutality is present, and those people terrorized by gangs are now terrorized Or those people who were once terrorized by gangs are now being terrorized by people in uniforms. Oh my God. 5 more minutes. Delivery drivers, construction workers, students, they have been taken to prison without any evidence. Thousands of mothers flock to prisons and the Human Rights Commission to ask where their children are being held or whether they're still alive. To no response. They often demonstrate that their kids have stable jobs, a university career, and even produce evidence to show that they have no prior convictions. To no avail. The threat of arbitrary arrest looms over Salvadorans who are choosing to live in silence. And the organization that advocates for the release of innocents arrested has been subject to threats of incarceration too. In this period, we have also learned that almost 350 people have died inside Nayib Bukele's prisons. Some others have died shortly after being released after months of medical neglect. Forensic analysis shows that in many cases, there have been signs of broken bones and punctured lungs. Many families have found out about the passing of their relatives not because of an official call, but after a funeral home reached out to offer their services. In addition to that, people who have been released and have spoken to media outlets have denounced beatings, torture, lack of medical supplies, and that this violence is rarely targeted at actual gang members being locked up. Out of the thousands arrested, a significant percentage, over 90% of people, have been accused of illicit associations, not murder, rape, extortion, kidnapping, just a generic blanket charge. In essence, El Salvador has shifted the presumption of innocence, which is a bedrock of our legal system, that you are innocent until proven guilty. In El Salvador, if you're arrested, you're presumed guilty until you demonstrate that you're not, or until your case gets so viral on social media that authorities have to let you go. But not everyone is so influential, or until you pass. El Salvador is haunted by old ghosts we thought were long gone. Torture, arbitrary incarceration, politically motivated arrests, and fear, not of gangs, but of men and women in uniform. That concludes my third point, that this is a policy of mass incarceration, presumption of guilt, and violation of fundamental human rights. And lastly, my fourth point, what this means for the future. El régimen, as we call it, is an instrument of fear. In the last election, when the opposition denounced irregularities in the manual recount, members of Nayib Bukele's party threatened to apply el régimen to them. Worker unions and civil society leaders have been told that el régimen will also be applied if they continue protesting or raising their concerns. Street vendors have been evicted from informal shacks to clean up squares in the renovated San Salvador Historic City Center, and they have been told that if they voluntarily leave, el régimen will be applied to them. Young people with tattoos, men with long hair. We have reports that men have been arrested because they had long hair and the police officers threatened to cut his hair. And he's like, no, I don't want it. So they were taken. And youth from impoverished communities have been threatened by police officers and soldiers patrolling the streets. El régimen is no longer a security policy aimed at gangs. It is an instrument of social control. It is a policy to guarantee compliance and obedience by a man who has effectively controlled all power around himself. It is a cornerstone of Nayib Bukele's power grab, one that has rendered him the potential leader not of a one-party state, but of a one-man state. El Salvador is less dangerous, we agree. But if you disagree, if you have questions, if you have relatives that have been unjustly incarcerated, if you have been evicted, if you do not comply, and if you have tattoos, if you live in an impoverished or stigmatized community, it is not safer. And in the words of Milton Friedman, nothing is more permanent than a government temporary program. This regime of exception may be lifted, but the wide net of criminal reforms that constitute a presumption of guilt will linger. El Salvador has traded freedom for security, and we know how the story goes. As a country, we have given a man unrestrained and unchecked power. To believe he will not abuse of it, solely based on him not being a leftist, or him liking the same politicians that you do, or him liking Bitcoin, is a dangerous and naive experiment. Going back to the resolution on the table, Latin America has experienced the Bukele model before, and many times. It came in the form of grave human rights violations throughout the 20th century. The Nayib Bukele security policy is in fact a desirable model, but not for Latin American societies who wish to live safely. It is a desirable model for those who utilize fear as a tool to exert control. It is a highly desirable model for aspiring autocrats. Thank you.